Hey everyone, I'm Megyn Kelly. Welcome to the Megyn Kelly Show. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., born into the Kennedy dynasty and the namesake of one of the most famous men in America. He has been in the spotlight for decades. Many of us grew up seeing the Kennedy family as the closest thing we had to American royalty. The patriarch, Joseph Kennedy, an entrepreneur, ambassador to the UK, and first head of the SEC under President Roosevelt, helming a family of 9 children, one of whom is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s dad. The names of those children would come to define politics for much of the 20th century as they became war heroes, senators, attorneys general, even a president. Bobby's father was Attorney General Robert Kennedy, assassinated in 1968 while on his way toward becoming the Democratic nominee for president. Bobby was just 14 years old at the time, but years later would go on to follow in his father's legal footsteps, entering the legal profession and becoming one of the nation's top environmental lawyers, leading the charge against various toxins and pollutants and demanding remediation of chemical wastelands like the Hudson River in New York. But it is his position on vaccines that has left him a bit of an outcast in some circles, including with many in the medical community, the media, and even with some of his own family. I spoke to Robert for nearly 4 hours, my longest interview ever. We discussed everything from his position on vaccines and censorship to the claims he makes in his latest book, The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health. The book, essentially blackballed by the media, is nonetheless an enormous hit with the American people, making the bestsellers lists of the New York Times, Amazon, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. And while what you're about to hear is not a cheerleading session on vaccines, it is an important conversation about public health, the agencies in charge, and whether we have been getting the protection we deserve from those we fund with our tax dollars. We taped this conversation about a week ago, and we have spent the time since taking a deeper dive into some of his more controversial claims. What you will hear are many of his opinions, along with some context and some fact-checking as we go. We did this because we want our audience to hear this discussion, but to understand where Robert and his critics most differ, and because we hope this exchange can be seen on as many public platforms as possible. We think it's a vital exchange. Also, if you're watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast services, you can find links to other sources like the CDC, the WHO, and so on in our episode description. We've tried to provide you with as many resources as possible. You can make up your own minds. We talked about far more than just vaccines, however. This is, after all, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., including an incredibly revealing conversation about the toll his work has taken on his wife, actress Cheryl Hines, the assassinations of his father and his uncle, and why he thinks the Democratic Party is no longer what they fought so hard to represent. We even went there on Marilyn Monroe and claims about his father and his uncle allegedly having affairs with her. Truly, nothing to his credit was off limits. We have divided the interview into 2 separate shows because clearly there's a lot to cover. In today's show, we dive into vaccines. I asked him point blank how he can claim to be pro-vaccination, which is what he claims, when his words and positions sound far from it. We also look into Dr. Fauci, his career, his finances, and why Kennedy says Fauci is not the hero the media made him into during the COVID pandemic. Watch. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Megyn.
All right, let's start with the Fauci book, because one of the most interesting things about it is how it's been totally blackballed by basically everyone. I mean, it's been a complete media blackout on the book.
We've gone into 12 separate printings, and so we ran out of books a dozen times.
Wow.
And now they have plenty of books.
Wow. And Bobby, if we can, just to remind folks, your voice is a little raspy, and there's a reason for that, just so people aren't distracted. And would you care to share the reason for that?
I apologize to that, particularly to your listeners and to you, because my voice is really hard to listen to. I had a very, very, like, an unusually strong voice until I was 42 years old, 1996, 1997. I was struck with this condition, which is called spasmodic dystonia. My throat, actually, if you scoped my throat, it would look like a very, very healthy throat. But I have this is a neurological condition. So my brain is instructing my voice box to tighten up. And for some reason that nobody really understands, it goes in and out. So some days my voice is pretty strong, and other days it's very staggered and kind of difficult to listen to. And today is not a good day for my voice. So again, I apologize to you. And
not at all. Not at all. I'm sorry to even raise it.
You know what? Whenever I give a speech, Megyn, I'll always explain it to people because, it is, I can't listen to myself I have never listened to my own podcast. I don't listen to myself on TV or radio because it's disturbing for me to hear my voice. So I feel sorry for people who need to listen to it. And I feel like it helps me to give them an explanation.
You're worth it. You're worth it. And, I was thinking about it as I was reading about your condition, thinking it's a particularly cruel thing to have handed to you, right? I mean, it's quite literally the loss of your voice, right? It's to have your actual voice diminished in any way or interfered with must be galling, must be frustrating. I don't know. How has that felt to have that deteriorate?
Well, it's definitely a paradox or an irony because so much of what I do is depend on my voice as an attorney, as a public speaker, as, somebody who is a voice now kind of for the movement that, I have this particular disability, but, I think there's people who have a lot worse disabilities than me. I have a cousin who lost a leg when he was 11 years old. My family has been around people, working on disabilities for many, many years. So I've never spent even a second feeling sorry for myself or, it's just something that God gave me. Mm-hmm. I have to figure out why is this a gift? Why has this challenge been given to me? And that's, and then to do the best I can with it and not be deterred by it. It's not something I would complain about.
Well, the patriarch of the Kennedy family, Joseph Kennedy, the man with whom it all started, and that's your grandpa, Bobby Kennedy's dad, Jack Kennedy's dad. As I understand it, he wasn't so big on whiners. And so you were all raised from the cradle to toughen up and not walk around feeling woe is me.
Yeah, I think that's right. He would, if you whined around him, he would come into the house clapping his hands, said, "There are no whiners in this house. There's no complaining in this house." And, we were reminded growing up time after time that we were very, very fortunate. Compared to 99% of humanity, we had a very, very cushy existence, and that none of us really had a right to complain about anything. And I think it's a better way to live to just say you're not going to complain. I think self-pity is crippling to people.
Yes, I mean, coming from that kind of an upbringing and family approach to life. Today's day and age must be very frustrating to you. I'm sure your grandfather would be horrified to see how much we lean into victimhood today, whether actual or imagined. It's become something we prize. It's celebrated. It's no longer something to triumph over. It's more like, great, you've got something to complain about. We all want to hear it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that anybody ever got to their deathbed and said, I wish I had spent more time complaining. I think there's one of the things that I found out during my early sobriety, it was really a technique that was a gift to me, was that gratitude was a choice, and that, my inclination, I think the inclination of most people is not to be grateful, but to wake up every day with a sense of impending doom, and then, to look for reasons to be discontent. And it's really about the way that we process reality. You could have two people who are doing this, who are shoveling manure, and one of them could be whistling and laughing, and the other one could be grumbling and cursing. And it all is taking place inside our own heads. How do we choose to practice to process our reality? Do we choose to look at the glass half empty or glass full? Every day of my life, I make a gratitude list. I just list, a lot of banal things like orange juice, and antibiotics, and air conditioning, and the glass on the windows, the things that 20,000 generations of humanity never had those things. We live like gods compared to most of the human beings in history, even the most unfortunate American today. And so we can either choose to be grateful about those things, or we can, choose to be anxious. And, it was a revelation to me to learn to realize that was a choice, and it wasn't a condition that was imposed upon us.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, I wish people could understand the full extent of what you've been through. How old are you now?
I'm actually 68 years old.
68. You look so young. You look good. But because it's crazy. Like, people will have one of the many things that have happened to you and spend the rest of their lives lamenting it and leaning into their sadness, their depression. It's something that defines them. Not to bum you out, but I'm just off the top of my head. Obviously, your father was assassinated. Your uncle, the president of the United States, was assassinated when you were a young boy. Your cousin, JFK Jr., died far too young in a plane crash. You've had your own personal challenges, and here you are on a mission, staying on the thing that you care most about, the environment, public health. You've taken a ton of incoming. You've been demonized by large factions of the press. You never stop. And I admire it. Okay, so let's go and let's talk about vaccines, because I know a lot of people. The reason a lot of people will dismiss the book on Fauci is the prior stance on vaccines. And when you say RFK Jr. to people, they say, "Oh, he's against vaccines. He hates the MMR vaccine. It's saved millions of people. It's helped so many kids." And you have been critical of, obviously, the vaccine regime. So for the record, where do you stand on vaccines like the MMR vaccine and other related childhood vaccines today?
Well, I have never been anti-vaccine. That is a pejorative that's applied to me in order to marginalize me and silence me. And as you point out, have people dismiss me as somebody who's irrational or crazy. What I've said is we should have safe vaccines. Should have good, robust science. We should have regulators that are independent of the pharmaceutical industry that is profiteering on the vaccines.
That's true.
I started doing this work trying to get mercury out of the vaccines. And, and that was real. I was very focused on that issue because mercury clearly is a neurotoxin. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies that show that it is devastating. It causes dramatic IQ loss. It damages every organ. It causes all kinds of brain damage, and that there's no safe level of mercury exposure. And the idea that we would be injecting mercury directly into babies, I was suing at that time. This is 2005. I had lawsuits against, I think, 39 coal burning power plants and cement kilns for discharging mercury from the stacks. Mercury was precipitating out in the rainfall, getting into our fish. FDA did a study in 2003 that showed that every freshwater fish in America had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. And, it occurred to me that we were living a science fiction nightmare where my children and the children of every other American could now no longer engage in the seminal primal activity of American youth, which is to go fishing with their mom or dad at the local fishing hole and then come home and safely eat the fish. Oh, I've been trying for 17 years to get the mercury out of the vaccines. It's out of many American vaccines. We're still giving it to every African child, and it's still in the flu shots, which are given to pregnant women, which is insane. But, I spent 35 years trying to get mercury out of the fish, and nobody called me anti-fish. So I'm trying to get mercury out of the vaccines. It doesn't make me anti-vaccine. It makes, if the vaccine works, I'd be the first one to take it. And I took flu vaccines for 20 years every year. All of my children are fully vaccinated.
So the pushback that, against that claim is on the mercury. Let's just start with that. That, as I understand it, there are two types of mercury that we're dealing with, right? There's ethyl mercury in vaccines, and then there's methyl mercury, which is found in fish. And apparently, methyl mercury is more of a potent neurotoxin than ethyl mercury is, which is said to be safer, ethyl is, than methyl. And the experts, right, the people on the other side of you, that I'm using that term in quotes, experts, but they say that ethyl mercury in the vaccines will exit the body much faster. So it's less of a safety issue than the methyl mercury you might find in eating a fish. They say that, okay, so that's with respect to mercury. And there's a guy, I'm sure you've read his piece, he's a professor of pediatrics, director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Paul Offit, who says, look, the human body will eliminate ethyl mercury that's in vaccines far more efficiently than it eliminates naturally occurring methyl mercury that's in fish. So we're better at getting rid of the ethyl that would be in a vaccine. They use it as basically a preservative so that the vaccine remains viable to give to you. So they say we're way better at taking care of that ethyl mercury, our bodies. And he says that a baby would receive far more of this methyl mercury during the first 6 months of life than they would ever receive long before their first dose of, say, the influenza vaccine. And saying that just simply by living on Earth, he writes, by 6 months of age, babies will have ingested an amount of mercury that is 1,440 times greater than the safety limit that you propose. So in other words, even if we don't give the vaccines to the babies, or even if we take the mercury out of all vaccines, the babies are still going to be getting this methyl mercury thanks to their moms and the way we eat and so on, which belies the claim that somehow the ethyl mercury in the vaccines is somehow causing harm.
Okay, so Paul Offit, who told you that, knows that that's untrue. And the reason I know he knows it is because I had a conversation with him, which I recorded in 2006, which he admitted that was a lie. And here's what happened, Megyn. In that claim that ethyl mercury is quickly excreted from the body was made originally by Eli Lilly, which developed this thimerosal, the mercury preservative for vaccines in 1932. There was no science that supported them. It literally had no science. Then in 2000, but they were all repeating this again and again like a mantra. And in 2003, a CDC scientist called Picciero did a study that seemed to confirm that claim. And what he did was he measured the mercury levels in the blood of children who had been given a thimerosal vaccine. And within a week, the ethyl mercury in the vaccines had all disappeared. Then he gave the same children a tuna fish sandwich, and the methyl mercury from the tuna fish was in their blood 54 days later. That was the half-life. So his conclusion is, wow, we've been saying this for all these years, and it turns out to be true. And he published that in Pediatrics, and a bunch of scientists, like world authorities on mercury toxicity, like Dr. Boyd Haley from the chair of the chemistry department of the University of Kentucky, wrote a letter to the journal and said, "Oh, what happened to the ethyl mercury?" Because Picciero could not find it in the sweat of the children, the feces, the blood, the hair, or the fingernails, or the urine. What happened to it? Did it really leave the body? So NIH commissioned a monkey study by one of the famous, iconic scientists, Dr. Thomas Picciero at the University of Seattle in Washington, or University of Washington, Seattle. Mm-hmm. He took macaques. He did the same thing. He gave half of the macaques tuna fish sandwiches. He gave the other half mercury vaccines at the same level that our kids are getting. And he found the same thing that Picciero did. Within a week, mercury from the vaccine was gone from the blood. The mercury from the tuna was still in those monkeys 54 days later. But then when he sacrificed the monkeys, which means he killed them, did a PM and did mercury content postmortem of their brains, what he found was that the mercury in the brains of the monkeys who had gotten the ethyl mercury from the vaccines was more than double what the monkeys had who had gotten the tuna fish. Not only that, but the mercury had metabolized into organic mercury, which is the most toxic form of mercury. And we now know that 27 years later, it is still in the brain, causing inflammation, causing destruction. So it's very clear that ethylmercury is much worse for your brain than methylmercury. Why does Paul Offit told me the same story. This is something they repeat and repeat and repeat it, and they all know it's untrue. And that conversation that I had with him that I taped, and I hope at some time to depose him on. When I said to him, he said, well, Bobby, and listen, Paul Offit was very sweet to me on the phone. He said, I love your father. He said, your father is one of the reasons that inspired me to get into public health, et cetera. So I was inclined to really like Paul Offit. I'm susceptible to that kind of flattery. And then he started saying things to me that I knew weren't true. And I asked him this question. I said, how is it that the CDC recommends that pregnant women will not eat tuna fish sandwiches, and yet they're giving flu shots and other shots, DTP shots, the same women where the mercury is not going to be filtered out by stomach acids or by gastric fluids or the gastric process directly into the blood, and much greater loads than you would get from a tuna fish sandwich. And he told me that story. He said, Bobby, it's because there's two kinds of mercury. There's a good mercury, which is ethyl mercury in vaccines, and there's a bad mercury, the methyl mercury in fish. And I knew at that time that I was being lied to because I knew a lot about mercury, having litigated it, which is like getting a PhD. Mm-hmm. And I knew that there is no such thing as a good mercury and a bad mercury. His argument was not with me. It was with the periodic tables, and the periodic tables would beat him. So the fact that he is, and I confronted him. I said, how do you know it leaves? He said, because there's a study by Picciero. And I said, Dr. Offit, what about the Burbecker study? And there was dead silence.
With the monkeys.
And then he said to me, and I can play you this tape, he said, you're right, Bobby. The Picciero study doesn't really prove that. It's a mosaic of studies. And I said, a mosaic. Can you cite any of them? And he said, I'll get back to you. And that's the last I ever heard of Paul Offit. So he knows what he was a lie.
Okay, so
by the way,
yeah,
mercury is cumulative. And Dr. Offit is right. The kids have many exposures to mercury. Vaccines are much worse. And we know this because of FDA's own studies. There are internal studies that show that kids, by their own regulations, are receiving huge amounts of mercury, hundreds of times what the EPA maximum safe exposures are repeatedly during childhood from these vaccines. But Paul is right that we're getting mercury from everywhere. This was not true in pre-industrial times. There was no source of mercury from the environment. Kids, we were not designed for exposures to all these heavy metals. We're getting them out because there's pollution all around us, and there's dental amalgams, and there's all these other sources. We know that the exposures are cumulative.
Okay, so let me jump in. Let me jump in here and advance it, because the bottom line is that in 1997, the FDA did a review of this thimerosal, which has the mercury, which is what they put in the vaccines to preserve the vaccine. And the FDA found that the mercury level in the vaccine schedule was too high. The FDA found that. They said they found no evidence of harm from the use of thimerosal as a vaccine preservative, other than local hypersensitivity reactions. And nonetheless, though, they nixed it from the childhood vaccines. I mean, so whatever, people can draw their own conclusions about what the FDA really thought, but for whatever reason, it came out, or they said it came out. But as you point out, still in the flu vaccine, which is given to pregnant mothers. But about like the MMR and all that, they took it out. They said there's no data or evidence of any harm caused by the level of exposure that some children may have encountered in following the existing immunization schedule. This is 1999, because the fear in the 1990s was that you write all about this in your earlier book, but we basically had a situation where in the 1980s, these companies could get sued. These vaccine manufacturers could still get sued. And so one by one, they stopped wanting to manufacture vaccines. I mean, this, as a lawyer, that has a way of happening. And so under President Reagan, we gave them immunity. Basically said, you can't sue them anymore. We're going to create a pot of money for victims to sue if they think they've been vaccine injured, but you really can't sue the vaccine manufacturers. So then they started to develop more. And then lo and behold, the vaccine schedule started to have a bunch more requirements for young kids. So your pediatrician in the 90s was recommending way more vaccines for your kid than back when I was born in 1970. And parents started to do it. And then in the 90s, we started to see an uprise in the number of autism cases of the autism spectrum disorder. And the question came from many parents, is there a link? Did I do something to my child when I gave him all these many vaccines, more than have ever been required in a short amount of time? And then people started to look at the mercury in the vaccines to say, could that have been it? Too much. As Jenny McCarthy said, because she's one of the parents who believed it happened to her child, too many vaccines in too short a time. And they did study after study after study after study after study. And what the medical community concluded, right? I'm not going to say, I'm not a scientist. What they concluded is that mercury or no mercury, right? Like mercury, no one's making the case that it's perfectly safe, but that it didn't cause autism, that rise in autism could not be linked to thimerosal. And even when they took thimerosal out of all these vaccines, the number of autism cases continued to go up. So they used that to say, the argument that the vaccines in the 90s were causing autism in children it falls apart when you look at what happened after we took it out, which is the cases kept going up. The reason, they kept going up is, and the reason they were going up in the 90s is because we were casting a wider net for what would fall within autism and what wouldn't. We were more awake to what that disorder looks like, and we were slapping the proper label on it. It wasn't anything to do with the vaccines.
Okay, well, you raise a number of issues there. And again, these are all classic industry talking points, but let's take them one at a time. Number one, the mercury was not removed from the vaccines in 2003. It was removed from some of the pediatric vaccines, but at the same time, the CDC mandated for the first time, or what they call recommended, but it's effectively a mandate, flu vaccines for pregnant women and for children in every year of life. So the vaccines that they took out were vaccines they were giving 1, 2, 3, 4 times to kids. And now they're giving kids vaccines every single year. And for the first 15 years, 85 to 95% of the flu vaccines had bolus doses of mercury, meaning 25 micrograms, huge doses. The maximum exposure is 1 microgram. So they were getting it again and again and again. Furthermore, for the first time, they were recommending flu vaccines to pregnant women. Next, the mercury, when it was taken out of the other vaccines, was replaced with aluminum. And aluminum is also very, very similar, very potent neurotoxin. So now we're giving kids aluminum vaccines, and in the same wellness visit, you're giving them a mercury flu shot. So, the science on the impacts on autism are unclear. And, anybody who's looked at what CDC and NIH's and FDA's behavior during COVID understands that these are industries that are not doing public health. They are doing pharmaceutical profit promotion. Go out and look at this movie that is now on Netflix or Hulu called Dope Sick.
Yeah, we've seen it. We interviewed the creator.
It's how FDA conspired with pharmaceutical makers to addict American children to opiates.
100% true.
And so this is the same FDA and the same companies that are now killing 56,000 kids a year with opioids, more kids every year than were killed in the 20-year Vietnam War. Well, these are companies, and these are companies that are immoral, that are in many cases criminal. Pfizer paid the highest criminal penalties of any corporation in history. These are serial felons, and they have captured the agency that's supposed to be protecting us from their behavior.
Well, wait a minute. So let me pause you. I agree that the public health agencies have proven over the course of COVID that they're nothing of the kind, that they are in bed with Democrat politicians and with big pharma, and their behavior to this day, it confirms that in many ways. And we'll talk about that. But on the subject of vaccines, if you go back, if they're so bad, right? It's like, then why isn't everyone sick? Why don't we all have birth defects? Why don't we all have autism? And why did you give them to your kids? Stay tuned for Robert's response next. But first, we did reach out to Dr. Paul Offit on Robert's claim that he has Dr. Offit on tape admitting that he shares concerns about ethyl mercury in vaccines. Dr. Offit confirmed that Robert did indeed once record him, but he told us if he said what Robert is alleging on that tape, Robert would have released it publicly by now. We followed up with Robert's team on his offer to play us the tape. They said he recently moved and that it would be difficult to find in time for our air date. Also, regarding aluminum in vaccines, we spoke with one of our trusted doctors, Dr. David Dowdy, an infectious disease epidemiologist at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He's been on our show before. He says it's important to remember that the amount of aluminum in vaccines is substantially lower than the aluminum we inadvertently eat and drink and put under our arms and deodorant every day. We'll be right back. How many of you have been thinking about a backyard makeover? Do you wish you had room for a pool? You are going to love this idea, and your family and your friends will too. Get yourself a Michael Phelps Swim Spa by Master Spas. A Michael Phelps Swim Spa combines the benefits of a pool with the therapy of a hot tub. It comes in a variety of sizes to complement almost any yard, even if it's a teeny tiny backyard. Michael Phelps Swim Spas by Master Spas have a water current, so you can swim. You can do laps in even a smaller pool. You can do aquatic exercises. You can have fun with the kids. This is going to reinvent family time for you. The water buoyancy will relieve pressure on aching joints. You can enjoy pure relaxation in the massage therapy seats of the swim spa. And since it's heated, you can use it year-round in any climate. Michael Phelps Swim Spas are 100% made in the USA by Master Spas, the world's largest swim spa manufacturer. And you will love your Michael Phelps Swim Spa by Master Spas. And Master Spas has a special offer going on right now. You can get it by going to masterspas.com. Put in the promo code MK to save $1,000 on a Michael Phelps Swim Spa or $500 on a Master Spas hot tub. That's masterspas.com, promo code MK. On the subject of vaccines, if you go back, if they're so bad, right? It's like, then why isn't everyone sick? Why don't we all have birth defects? Why don't we all have autism? And why did you give them to your kids?
Well, because I didn't know, like most American parents, I didn't know. I just believed what my doctor said. I wasn't in this space. I wasn't studying what was happening. If I had to go back, I would not. But here's the thing, Megyn, is that, we are to say that kids aren't sick. Explain what happened with autism. What you just said is simply not true, that we're just noticing it more. You mean we missed it before?
That's not from me. That's from the experts.
Right. I know it's not from you. I
CDC
hear it all the time. But missing autism is like missing a train wreck. You can't do it. Listen, I was raised. I'll tell you a couple of things. One, we have gone the autism rates, which, the scientists in the 40s and 50s were as smarter than the scientists today. They knew what they were looking at. The first scientist to ever see autism to identify it was Leo Kanner in 1934. And he said nothing like this has ever been seen before in science and will never be seen again. It was genuinely rare. I was raised in the heart, at the spear tip of the movement to provide people with children with intellectual disabilities rights. My aunt Eunice, who was my godmother, started Special Olympics 10 miles from my home. I worked there every weekend when I was a kid as a hugger, a coach from when I was 8 years old. It was called Camp Shriver then. We changed it in 1968 to Special Olympics. I did because of my family's immersion. That part of our DNA is serving the community of people with intellectual disabilities. I spent 200 hours during my high school years at Wassaic Home for the Retarded in upstate New York as a helper. I never saw a case of full-blown autism. People back then, you had a quirky uncle or somebody who didn't have social skills. A full-blown autism, we never saw. We didn't see it in Special Olympics. We prided ourselves on being able to accommodate every child, no matter how debilitating their disability. So even children who are functionally vegetative, we could put them on a platform and have them, teach them to push a beanbag off onto the ground, and people would cheer for them and make it a good event. The kids today, these kids that we're seeing with autism that are nonverbal, non-toilet trained, screaming, biting, head banging, violent, toe walking, stimming. We never saw kids like that in the 60s and 70s. We just, and today, to this day, I have never seen somebody my age, 68 years old, who has full-blown autism. Where are they?
But let me ask you, because I know you as an environmental lawyer have to this day say there's all sorts of things in the environment that may be poisoning us. I'm sure you could give us the list, right? To make a link to the vaccines is a bridge too far. Say
actually a doctor out there who has made that list, because you have to. What happened is Congress said to EPA. And by the way, there are many, many studies, including the Mind Institute at UC Davis, commissioned by the California legislature, to answer the very question that you just asked. Could this be, changing diagnostic criteria? Could it be an expanded knowledge of diagnoses? The answer, they've said persistently, one after the other, is no. Whoever told you that from the industry knows that this is true.
I'm citing, I've read your book, and I know you say, why wasn't Dr. Fauci studying things like corn syrup, like just other toxins, about corn syrup, but other toxins in the environment.
Right. Exactly. So here's what Congress said. Congress said to EPA, and EPA is not a public health agency, so it's not part of HHS. All the other ones are NIH, CDC, and FDA, and they're all in the pocket of pharma. But EPA is in the pocket of the oil industry, but they don't care about pharma. They said, if Congress said to EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic began. And the EPA scientists came back and said, it's a red line, 1989. What happened in 1989? As you pointed out, we passed the Vaccine Act in 1986. We gave immunity from liability to all the companies. There was a gold rush because suddenly the biggest cost of producing pharmaceuticals and marketing pharmaceuticals, which is downstream liabilities, had been eliminated. They also didn't have to do upstream testing. So two of the biggest costs were gone. Plus, they don't have to do advertising and marketing because the product is mandated to 76 million American children. So it's a dream product for them, and they can charge basically anything they want. It was a gold rush, and they added all these new vaccines to the schedule. And people, when they think of vaccines, think of polio and smallpox and the miracles of eliminating those. But these were many of these diseases are completely unnecessary to vaccinate against. Things like that are not even casually contagious, like hepatitis B that you get from, unprotected sex with, or from sharing needles.
What about
There's
measles?
No way you can do that to a day-old baby, and yet rotavirus, hepatitis B, all of these other, so-called diseases that are just on the schedule because the vaccine companies can make money from them.
What about measles?
Well, the MMR vaccine never had mercury in it. And let me just tell you what happened. And I'll answer that question too.
Okay.
Because it's a complex issue, because the measles vaccine definitely eliminates measles, or close to eliminates it.
Mm-hmm.
There are breakthrough cases. So first of all, there's a number of questions you have to ask. Was measles a killer disease? It clearly was at the beginning of the century. In 1963, it was killing only 400 kids a year. Mainly, they were kids who had malnutrition or some other devastating comorbidity. A lot of them were Black children in the Mississippi Delta. This is before we had the poverty programs. And, my father went down there and found severe malnutrition like you'd see in Africa or South Asia. Those were the kids who were dying. It was the death rate was 1 in 500,000, so 2 in a million. It was very, very small for measles. And the measles vaccine, started in 1963. It never had thimerosal in it because it's a live virus vaccine. We had, and then in 1999, CDC did a study, an internal study, because of what you said a few minutes ago. That all of a sudden, in the beginning in '89, we went ultimately from 3 vaccines that I have a kid, that I took as a kid, to the 72 doses of 16 vaccines that my children had to take. And this began in the 90s. And in the 90s, people started to see this explosion of neurological disorders. And it wasn't just autism. Autism went from 1 in 10,000 or 3 in 10,000, depending on what studies you follow, to 1 in 44 kids today.
Yep.
But not only autism, all the neurodevelopmental disorders, the ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics. I never heard of tics when I was a kid. I had 11 brothers, 70 cousins, never knew anybody with tics. Narcolepsy, ASD, and autism. The allergic diseases suddenly appeared. I never knew anybody with a peanut allergy. Why do 5 of my 7 kids have allergies? Eczema, asthma, which we had, but it's now 1 in every 4 Black children. We never saw.
I get all that, but that doesn't prove causality.
Oh, you talk to anybody who's my age. These are all new diseases. We went.
I get it, but
when Tony Fauci came into office, because this answers your previous question, why aren't we seeing the sick kid? We are. When Tony Fauci came into office, 6% of American children had chronic disease.
Okay, but that doesn't prove causality with vaccines.
By 2006, 54%. Now, you make the point. There are many other exposures besides vaccines. Our kids today are swimming around in a toxic soup. And I don't just work on vaccines. I was part of the trial team in the Monsanto case. I work on pesticides. I work on neonicotinoids. I work on PFOAs, PFAS. I was on the trial team that tried the Dark Waters case that Mark Ruffalo is now in that movie. I do EMFs, all of these different exposures that began on the same timeline. So Phil Landrigan, who's probably the most famous toxicologist in this country, at Mount Sinai in New York, made a list of 11 potential culprits of toxics that became ubiquitous in 1989. Following that timeline you have to find something that impacted every demographic in this country the same year, which, from Cubans in Biscayne Bay to Inuit in Alaska. There's only a small number of those. And it's very easy. So you can identify them, and he did. And one of them, the potential, is the vaccines. I think all of them, I think these impacts and what the science shows, all these impacts are cumulative. And our kids today are sick because we are bombarding their immune systems with these toxics that they simply cannot handle. Vaccines is part of that story. And it's probably, in my view, the largest single cause, although all of them are very big. Now, in 1999, CDC was also alarmed by the same thing that you described with the parents. So they decided to do an internal study of their own database, which is called the Vaccine Safety Data Link. It's the medical records, including the vaccination records, of 10 million kids from the 10 biggest HMOs. So it's all the cumulative medical records from all those HMOs, and they're all housed in one place. And they said, let's see if these mercury vaccines are causing autism. So they looked at one vaccine. They can look at every vaccine record, and then they can look at your medical claims to see if you had seizure disorders or allergies, or if you have an autism diagnosis. They can do a cluster analysis, and they can look for associations. So they looked at the hepatitis B vaccine, which is loaded with mercury, during the first 30 days of life. They looked at kids who got it during the first 30 days. They compared them to kids who did not get it during the first 30 days, who got it later or didn't get it at all. And here's what they found. The relative risk of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for 20 years and lung cancer is 10. This was 11.35. They knew.
Is that because of thimerosal?
What was causing from thimerosal? This is what the story that got me involved, because they pushed the panic button, and they had a secret meeting. They didn't want to do it on the CDC campus because they thought it would be susceptible to freedom of information requests. So they did it in a remote Methodist retreat center on the banks of the Chattahoochee River in Norcross, Georgia. And it was called Simpsonwood. They had a 2-day meeting with 52 individuals, including all the major vaccine companies, regulatory agencies that administer vaccines, WHO, CDC, FDA, NIH, HHS, and the leaders, the leading academic vaccinators. So the people who basically conduct clinical trials and make hundreds of millions of dollars for medical schools around this country. And the first day, and somebody, Megyn, recorded that meeting. We don't know why. We don't know if they knew they were being recorded, but I got a hold of the transcripts in 2005, and it is horrific. It's a nightmare. Any of your listeners can go to our website, see Zero Children's Health Events, and read those transcripts and make up your own mind about what happened. And you see the pangerms of the American healthcare system, these regulators who are supposed to be protecting us. For the first day, they're looking at the science and they are saying it's bulletproof. We are causing autism.
I want the audience to be aware of the FDA and the National Institutes of Health, the CDC, the American Association of Pediatrics, and several other agencies have concluded there is no evidence that thimerosal causes any harm, that there's none that it causes any harm. They removed it from vaccines anyway, they say, as a precautionary measure. They also are concerned about the resurrection of measles. In 2015, nearly 200 Americans were sickened with it. And that's a disease that we had eradicated 15 years earlier as a consequence of parents not vaccinating their kids. As you point out, it's a disease that could be potentially deadly. You've made this claim before about this horrific conference in which they confessed, it's causing autism. We got to bury the data. You wrote about it in a January 2011 article that was in Rolling Stone and Salon. It's since been withdrawn by Salon altogether. Rolling Stone had to offer a bunch of corrections. It removed it from its website as well. And your allegation spurred an 18-month investigation by a U.S. Senate committee that found allegations of CDC misconduct were unsubstantiated, and they concluded that there was no cover-up.
It was a 2-year committee hearings by Senator Burton at the Government Oversight Committee, and he found that there was a cover-up and that vaccines do cause autism. So, anybody can go, don't trust me. Listen, anything I say about the science, you shouldn't trust me. You should go do your own research. And I'll tell you, the research that I'm relying on, and you can go make up your own mind. Mm-hmm. You also should not trust CDC, NIH, the American Association of Pediatrics or Academy of Pediatrics, which gets 80% of its money from the pharmaceutical industry. FDA gets 45% of its budget from the pharmaceutical industry. CDC spends $4.9 billion of its $12 billion budget.
I get it. I'm not going to argue with you that those organizations are bought and paid for. We've seen that. But I got to ask. But let me ask you. Let me ask you. No, let me ask you, because the parents inside those organizations vaccinate their children. The parents who work for Pfizer stick the needle in their kids' arms. Like, are they willingly hurting their children? Like, why would they all be giving the MMR and the vaccines that had thimerosal in it? You're alleging sort of a vast government conspiracy to force these vaccines on us from these health quote unquote officials who knew it was unsafe, but yet they gave it to their own kids.
Megyn, go look at the movie Dope Sick, and
I watched it.
You'll answer your own question. The doctors in that movie.
That's different. They weren't sticking their kids with
they were
opioids.
Giving their patients and their children opioids because they believed what FDA told them.
We'll pick up the conversation in 1 minute, but first, a note on the exchange we just had about that Simpsonwood conference on thimerosal. In 2007, a U.S. Senate Committee on Public Health did investigate allegations that this meeting established the dangers of thimerosal and that the CDC came up with a plan to cover up those dangers. The committee found that, quote, allegations of a cover-up are not substantiated. Instead of hiding the data or restricting access to it, CDC distributed it, often to individuals who had never seen it before, and solicited outside opinion regarding how to interpret it. The transcript of these discussions was made available to the public, end quote. The Senate report went on to conclude, quote, Simpsonwood participants generally agreed that the data set was weak, it was difficult to assess causality, and further study and investigation were warranted. Now, the author of the original hypothesis that thimerosal might be linked to autism went on to conclude in phase 2 of his study that the original results being discussed at Simpsonwood could not be replicated. By the time he reached that conclusion, he had begun working for GlaxoSmithKline, which makes vaccines, but the Senate committee believed that his findings were in earnest. Also, when Robert made reference in our conversation to Senator Burton having concluded that there was a cover-up, he was actually referring to former Congressman Dan Burton. Burton did hold many hearings in Congress over this issue because he firmly believes that thimerosal contributed to his grandson's autism. We'll be right back. How old does your mirror say you are? And is it lying to you? Ladies and gentlemen, you can change the answer that mirror is giving you by 5, 10, or even 15 years with the new Ultra Retinol Cream from Genucel. One user, Marina from Fort Lauderdale, says, great product. My skin loves it. I have spent so much money on creams over the years, enough to pay off my house. Just kidding. But it feels like that. This product has changed my life like no other. Marina is flying high thanks to Genucel's new Ultra Retinol Cream with hyaluronic acid. This incredibly powerful anti-wrinkle treatment is packed with a blend of natural ingredients that gives your skin all of the benefits of a retinol without any of the unwanted irritation. Go to Genucel.com/MK60 now for up to 50% off the brand new Ultra Retinol Cream. You will be amazed with the results of you'll get your money back. You will also get Genucel's immediate effects for results in 12 hours or less, free with your order. Just go to Genucel.com/MK60. That's GENUCEL.com/MK60. Free express shipping, free returns, exquisite customer service. Genucel.com/MK60.
I would say is there's a small group, and I can tell you the names of the people within CDC, within FDA, and within NIH who know what they're doing and are doing it anyway, but it's a small group. But everybody else, because of the way that the medical system works, gets subsumed in that orthodoxy. And it's very much the way that, the Catholic Church reacted to the pedophile scandal. There was only a handful of priests, relatively, who were raping children. And 9 out of 10 priests who weren't. But all of them, the priests, the monsignors, the bishops, the archbishops, all the way up to the Vatican, became trapped in this subsumed in this orthodoxy that we need, that this institution is so important to children, to peace, to all of these other good things, that the people who are getting injured are collateral damage. How does it happen? And it's exactly the phenomena that you're talking about. And I think they do a really good job in the movie Dope Sick of showing how good, idealistic, high-minded, patient-oriented doctors ended up giving this poison to their patients, to their children, to their families, because they believe the regulators. And, Americans are idealists.
No, I got all that. And I mean, I don't even think you have to go to Dope Sick. I don't even think that's your best example. I think you're better off.
You tell me because...
Yeah, no, I think that what's happened during COVID with all these doctors and all these organizations writing articles about how masks are the key to our safety, which completely fell apart. And all the medical professionals who wrote that this 100% did not begin in a lab, but it came from, some animal source, which we've never found despite testing 80,000 animals. Right. Well, how did Fauci get all the doctors to go along with that? He's got a lot of influence. I get it. I get your point. However, the reality is the studies on this saying there is no link between the vaccines and autism, any of, from the MMR or otherwise, come not just from the United States. They come from the UK. They come from Canada. They come from Denmark. They do come from the CDC. They come from independent physicians. They come from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I could go on. It's a worldwide conspiracy to stick needles in the arms of babies, irrespective of the catastrophic damage we could be causing to them cognitively?
Let me tell you what the National Academy of Sciences and the Institute of Medicine say. They, pull off in all those groups that you talk about, have studied two things. One vaccine, which is the MMR vaccine. They've only done one kind of study.
According to you, that's problematic too.
Epidemiological studies, which are very easy to fix. They don't do bench trials. They don't do animal trials. And they've studied one ingredient, thimerosal. But when we sued them, they admitted that that of all the vaccines that are given during the first 6 months of life, the ones that are the only ones that could be related to birth autism, that they've never studied a single one of them. So you show me a study of the MMR vaccine, the DTP vaccine, the Hib vaccine, and I'll concede to you, you cannot show me those studies. You can only show me the one study and one kind of study, which is the MMR, and they deliberately restrict it. And by the way, those people, all those studies that you're talking about from all over the world, look who funded them. 2 groups or 3 groups. Wellcome Trust, which is GlaxoSmithKline, the pharmaceutical industry, or NIH. Oh, they're being funded by people who are funding them in order to cover up the association. And you can easily design, particularly epidemiological studies, you can conceal the impact to small subgroups of vulnerable populations. And that is epidemiology 101. Everybody knows that. And that's why they do those studies and they don't do other studies.
I mean, I understand. I get what you're saying. I also understand that many medical professionals, my own on up, will say that the risk of flu to children is far more significant and dangerous than the risk from any minuscule trace of thimerosal in the vaccine. And you can also get the vaccine without thimerosal in it now. And
so unfortunately, the people who get the ones without the thimerosal are wealthy people who know to ask the questions. The thimerosal vaccines are sent to poor Black neighborhoods where, there's no political power. There's no power for them to ask or to object or to get an alternative. And they're sent to 161 million children in Africa annually. So this is an attack on the poor. And, listen, I just want to point something out that people should understand. When you hear that the science says this because CDC says it, or because my doctor says it, or because FDA says it, that is a debating technique that is known as a logical fallacy. It's specifically known as appeals to authority. So instead of showing me the scientific study, which you cannot show me, that shows that flu vaccines save more lives than they cost, you cannot show me a study that shows that. I can show you many studies, and I've written about this. It is on our website. It's in the Dear Sanjay Gupta letter. You can go through each of those studies, and you can link to the study in preeminent journals by independent scientists, universities, research centers all over the world. You cannot show me a study that shows that the flu vaccine actually averts more problems than it causes. You cannot show me that study. If you show me that study, then I will walk away from that issue.
Mm-hmm. I know, but every time I say, listen, I understand, I've ceded to you the point that the CDC is not necessarily a public health organization, but that doesn't mean that everything they've ever said is wrong and that we get to discard every single study that they've done. There are hundreds of millions of people who have gotten these vaccines who are perfectly healthy, in part thanks to the vaccines. They're not walking around with measles. They're not walking around with flu. They're not walking around with rubella. They don't have Hep B. Those are good things. The vaccines are not all bad. Just because we have suspicions about some of them, and in particular the COVID vaccine, it doesn't mean we can. And because you started this, Bobby, by saying I am not anti-vax. You started it by saying I'm not, and then you cited as evidence of that the fact that you had all of your. Let me finish. You cited as evidence of that you had all of your children vaccinated, and then when I said, well, then if you have all these concerns, why did you have your children vaccinated? And you said, well, I didn't know any of this back then. So the fact that you had your children vaccinated does not suggest you are not anti-vax. And listening to you now for an hour, you sound very anti-vax to me.
Well, let me say this. Here's my bottom line. Show me or call all of these guys who you talk to on, Paul Offit and the other people and ask them to show you a scientific study for each vaccine that shows that this vaccine is averting more harm than it's causing. That's all I ask for. That
they say the studies show no linkage of harm. That's what they say. They show no linkage between autism and the vaccines or any other harm.
Look at the health outcomes. Okay, can I give you an example?
Well, I really kind of want to move on to the Fauci book. So, I think the audience, well, listen, I think the audience has a feel for your position and that of the CDC and the other authorities. They can make up their mind at this point. Let's advance the discussion, okay? With respect to you. Then they could read the book, and they should read both of your books. Black Rifle Coffee Company is a veteran-founded company serving premium coffee to people who love America. They developed their explosive roast profiles with the same mission focus learned as military members serving this great country. And in 2021, Black Rifle Coffee donated over 100,000 bags of coffee, which is over 2.1 million cups of coffee, to first responders, law enforcement, and active duty military members. So you know that with every purchase you make, Black Rifle really does give back. Black Rifle Coffee Company imports high-quality coffee beans from Colombia and Brazil, and then they roast them 5 days a week at their facilities right here in America, Manchester, Tennessee, and Salt Lake City, Utah, to be exact, which means you get the freshest coffee possible no matter where you live. The best way to enjoy Black Rifle's freedom-filled coffee is with the Black Rifle Coffee Club. When you join the club, like I have, your brew of choice is going to be roasted, packaged, and shipped. I was going to say stripped, not stripped. That's something you can do in private. In the meantime, you'll get it shipped free to your door on your schedule. Not only do you save a trip to the store, you receive special discounted pricing on roasts, you gain access to exclusive products, partner discounts, and you get to be part of the coolest club on the planet. Purchase at blackriflecoffee.com. Use the code MK at checkout for 20% off your purchase and your first coffee club order. That's blackriflecoffee.com/MK. Use that code MK. Black Rifle Coffee, America's coffee. Welcome back to the Megyn Kelly Show. Next up in our discussion, Dr. Anthony Fauci. In his book, Robert writes several chapters about Dr. Fauci's finances. He's not the only person who has done deep dives on this. Recently, former Forbes reporter Adam Andrzejewski wrote several articles on all the money Dr. Fauci has made while working for us, the U.S. government. We fund him and them from pay raises and big bonuses to royalties and investments. All added up, he reports it's several $million Dr. Fauci has received. In return for that reporting, Adam says he was fired by Forbes. But Robert Kennedy says he does not think Fauci's main focus is money. So I asked him, what is it?
I would characterize Anthony Fauci as kind of the preeminent architect of agency capture, of the transfer of NIAID and also its parent agency NIH from a public health agency to an agency that is primarily concerned with drug promotion, with drug development and drug promotion, and partnering with the pharmaceutical industry on profit-making enterprises.
Does he personally make a profit through this?
I would say that is the least important factor in this, in this problem.
Well, what's his motivation?
Legally, he can make money, and he does it. We know at least one patent he has. Any product that is developed by NIAID, anybody who works on that product that he designates can get a patent margin rights on that product that entitle them under the federal rules now to collect $150,000 a year in royalty for life. So he has 4 of his top employees who each have margin rights, patent rights, royalty rights for the Moderna vaccine. Because we put a U.S. taxpayer through Fauci, put in $1.5 billion, now $2.5 billion to develop that vaccine. NIH claims half of the vaccine, to own half of the vaccine. So it stands to make billions and billions of dollars, the agency, but also high-level individuals, influential individuals in the agency, people who are very loyal to Tony Fauci, can get awarded through Fauci the rights to get to collect lifetime royalties on those products, and they make hundreds and hundreds of products. They develop hundreds and hundreds of products, and all of those are potential profit-making enterprises for people, high-level people within NIH.
But you don't seem to be alleging that that's really his motivation.
No, I don't think that's his motivation.
Is it power? Like, what's the motivation? Power?
I think it's power. Yeah. You know what, Megan? One of the things I really try to do in the book is to never look into his head. And never, or Bill Gates' head or any of the other people in the book, and say, this is why they're doing it, because I don't know. I don't know what motivates them. What I do, my job is to document their conduct. And if you look at his conduct time after time after time, he does things that are consistent with making profits for his partners, which are, these pharmaceutical companies. And that even at the direct and clear expense of public health.
What can you talk about his relationship with Bill Gates? Because I'll tell you, on the lunatic fringe, with respect to the lunatic fringe, there literally are people in the country who think that if you get the COVID vaccine, they're injecting a little bot in your arm that Bill Gates created that's going to monitor you and report information back on you to Bill Gates. Now that's crazy town. But that's not to say that Bill Gates has absolutely no connection, certainly, to vaccines, Big Pharma, or Anthony Fauci. So can you talk about that relationship between the two of them?
And by the way, the idea that these monitoring chips are in the vaccines, I have never promoted that and don't believe that to be true. One of the stories I tell in my book is that that WHO, with Gates's influence, support, participation, administered 1 million vaccines to Kenyan women that designed to sterilize them without their knowledge and against their will, pretending it was a tetanus program that included in the tetanus vaccines, without anybody knowing, human gonadotrophic hormones, which interact with tetanus toxoids as essentially a chemical castration drug for women. And he gave that to WHO, gave that to at least 1 million women in Kenya. And they had similar programs in Nicaragua and Mexico and the Philippines, which clearly they were doing that, although we don't have the vials. We got the vials from Kenya, so we know what they were doing, and they've admitted it. They've
admitted that they secretly sterilized African women against their will and without their knowledge?
And I would urge you to read this chapter in my book. They've admitted that there was first denied that there was human gonadotrophic hormone in that vaccine, which there's no reason it should have been, and then admitted that there were. But if you read my book, you'll read that for 20 years, WHO has been spending tens of millions of dollars developing these sterilization drugs to surreptitiously give women. Now, this sounds paranoid, but they've published papers on it.
Well, as you already established, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. No. I'm saying WHO has paid researchers to find ways to chemically castrate women.
Against their will and without their knowledge.
Well, we don't know.
Well, that's a relevant factor. Some women get an IUD put in. Some women get their tubes tied.
Of course it is. All I can tell you is from the papers, it's just saying these are studies that are developing drugs. They're saying, here's how this works, and we test it on people, and it works. And then when it came time for them to use those products that WHO spent all those years developing, they gave it to 1 million women surreptitiously without their knowledge. So the papers don't say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to sneak up on them and ambush them. The papers say, here's how you develop this vaccine, and you hide it in a tetanus vaccine. And then when it actually came time for them to do the program, they did not tell the women. And they were caught by the Catholic Medical Association of Kenya, who noticed that, first of all, usually when you give a tetanus vaccine, you only give 1 dose, and it's good for 10 years. But they were told to give 5 doses in 6 months, which made the doctors, the Catholic Medical Association, say something's wrong here. And it was only given to women of childbearing years, women from 14 years old to, I think, 34 years old, which was weird because men also get tetanus. Third, there was no tetanus outbreak at that time. That's when the Catholic Doctors Association got a hold of the vials, and they tested them in 6 different labs. And they all came back, or most of them, not all of them, but most of them came back and said, yeah, they contain this drug.
Look, I understand, and I have read your book, and I understand there are plenty of allegations in there speaking about what Bill Gates has done in Africa and the number of people who have been hurt or killed by experimental vaccines that he's behind. What I also understand is most of the experts who look at this and work with the Gates Foundation or with Bill Gates say he's saved millions of lives with the vaccines that he's pushed. Let's put it in context. He has been testing medicines in Africa, sometimes with success and sometimes not, in an effort to improve public health over there. There's no evidence he's some madman who's out there on a quest to kill women, African or otherwise.
You can attack me personally, which is what they do, or ignore the book, but nobody has found a single factual error in my book. The book is 230,000 words. It has 2,200 footnotes. Every factual assertion is cited and sourced to peer-reviewed publications or to government databases. And, if they really believe that I was saying something that was untrue, why not come out and say what it is.
The WHO and Kenyan authorities have both said that the claim about sterilizing Kenyan women using the tetanus vaccine is incorrect, that it's not fact-based, and the UN Health Agency says the vaccine is safe. Okay, for the record. The World Health Organization has dismissed that the presence of HCG in the vaccine is a problem. They've confirmed that it's safe. I understand you reject that, but this is what they say. They say the vaccine has been used in 50... Let me just finish. They say, quote, the vaccine has been used in 52 countries to immunize 130 million women to protect them and their newborn babies from tetanus. This is from WHO in November 2014. There is no HCG hormone in tetanus toxoid vaccines. And they go on to say that the Kenyan health authorities, they say the allegations that describe this is a problematic or a deadly vaccine are baseless, not backed by scientific evidence, and ill-intended to cause fear and despondency among Kenyans in the uptake of much-needed essential health services. Go ahead.
Have they explained why the HGH was in the vaccine? There's no reason to put it in the vaccine. Initially, they said it's not in there, and now they're saying in the current ones it's not in. But they admitted that it was in the ones that the Catholic Doctors Association tested. And they could not, they said, oh, it's in there, but it wasn't put in there to sterilize women. And it's not in large enough.
And they say it's
quantity.
safe. I mean, and they say that the vaccines are safe and that they're there to protect women and their newborn babies from tetanus. Yeah. So, I mean, look, we're out on a thin reed talking about the intentional sterilization of women in Africa without their consent or knowledge.
The evidence is very well documented.
You're suggesting there was an intention to sterilize women without their consent.
They spent 20 years studying the inclusion of HGH in tetanus vaccines as a way to sterilize women. Then they included HGH in a tetanus vaccine program that they gave to 1 million women without telling them. So, you can connect whatever dots you need to or not.
I got it.
That's all.
Let's move forward. One of your principal beefs against Fauci is the way he handled the AIDS epidemic, which is something he's been universally lauded for. And we've had folks come on the show and raise issues before about how he handled, in particular, the drug AZT, and draw parallels between his fealty to that drug above all other treatments back in the 80s when treating HIV, and his fealty to the COVID vaccine at the expense of all other treatments in the past 2 years. So what does that tell us about Dr. Anthony Fauci?
Well, I think it speaks for itself. AZT was horrendously toxic. It was developed originally by the National Cancer Institute as a chemotherapy drug, and it killed all the rats when they gave it to them. So, chemotherapy drugs will kill you. Virtually 100% of them are going to kill you. They're designed to kill human cellular tissue. The hope is they will kill the tumor tissue before they kill the rest of you. And so when you give somebody a chemotherapy drug, it's only given for a couple of weeks. And then, they look at what's happened to the tumor and what's happening to you. But this drug was regarded as so horrendously toxic that they threw it on the junk pile, and they didn't even patent it. And then, when AIDS came along, of course, what they do when they find a new virus is they take all of these different compounds and they have petri dishes full of the virus, of live colonies, and then they put they put a dropper of toxic compound onto the petri dish and see if it kills the virus. If it kills the virus, they now have an antiviral drug, but they also have to find out whether it kills the human. And with the AZT or the rats, the AZT, it was regarded as too toxic to use for a 2-week course for chemotherapy. And GlaxoSmithKline found that it did kill HIV virus. And so they, spearheaded this effort. They were called Burroughs Wellcome at that time. They spearheaded this effort to get it approved. And Tony Fauci, because he did not know at that point, NIAID had never developed the drug. it won it won jurisdiction over AIDS. Originally, the National Cancer Institute, which knows how to develop drugs, that's what they do. They inherited AIDS because the initial signal for AIDS was Kaposi sarcoma, which is a cancer. So it went to the National Cancer Institute. But then when Luc Montagnier said, wait a minute, we found HIV viruses in 47% of the men who have AIDS. Maybe the virus is causing the AIDS. Tony Fauci used that to say this is an infectious disease. It's not being caused by toxics. It's an infectious disease, and therefore it should come to NIAID, National Institute for Allergic and Infectious Diseases. He didn't, unlike National Cancer Institute, he did not know how to develop a drug. So it made him very dependent on GlaxoSmithKline. And that really was the beginning of his permanent association with drug companies. He needed to develop a drug fast. He put GlaxoSmithKline on employees and loyalists on all of the committees that approved new drugs or experimental drugs, and they kept everything out of the competition except for their drug. And then they rushed it through, and Tony Fauci helped them rush it through. They used a number of fraudulent tricks to get the drug approved. The drug was killing, AZT was killing everybody who took it in the study group. And what Fauci did and Burroughs Wellcome did is they started giving the people who they were giving AZT, they started giving them blood transfusions to keep them alive. And when you give somebody a blood transfusion, it makes them, when their body's filled with toxic chemicals, it makes them healthier and longer lived. And the only reason those people survived a 6-week drug trial was because they were getting these transfusions. And then he got the drug approved. On very, very little evidence and clear safety signals. And that drug, according to critics, killed 330,000 people over the next 10 years.
So by the time we get to, more present day, Anthony Fauci, you write in the book that he kind of went, not underground, but he kind of got quieter and left the national scene for a number of years and was running this organization and became a kingmaker and controlled a bunch of money. And, there was utter fealty to him, as there still is in this public health industry. So then you write that we had a couple of not real pandemics, but we had other problems with, bird flu and some other things and earlier SARS issues. And that he sees opportunity when those things happen. He sees an opportunity to what? Because you argue that he sort of saw the ultimate opportunity with COVID-19. NIAID, one of the things I talk about is the history of both CDC and NIAID. By the middle of the 20th century, epidemic infectious diseases, mortalities from infectious diseases had essentially disappeared. And it had disappeared not because of vaccines, as is now claimed. They disappeared primarily because of nutrition, better nutrition, better sanitation, chlorinated water, electric refrigerators, road systems, reductions in overcrowding. And the reason I say this is not that you should believe me, but the CDC studied this question in the year 2000, along with Johns Hopkins, and they looked at the question, at the claim that vaccines had something to do with the reduction, this profound reduction, an 80% reduction in mortalities from infectious diseases since the beginning of the 20th century. And the scientists from CDC, and you can read this study, and Johns Hopkins, you can read this study in pediatrics, and it's called Guyer, Guyer 2000, Guyer et al. 2000. What they concluded is that vaccines had virtually nothing to do with this profound reduction in mortality from infectious diseases. The diseases were disappearing, not the disease themselves. People were still getting measles, they just weren't dying from it. But
the mortalities had disappeared because of these engineering improvements. And what was happening at CDC and NIAID is they were losing relevance because very small numbers of Americans were dying from infectious disease. And the Reagan administration and its budget director in 1982, David Stockman, were actually publicly saying that we should abolish CDC. And, as I point out in the book, there was memos going around saying we need to figure out infectious diseases to make ourselves relevant again. And so, what I show is that there's a series of fake pandemics that were done in 1976, right after Tony Fauci came to NIAID. There was a swine flu epidemic, a bird flu epidemic that was fake. In 2005, I think only one person died. There was a fake swine flu epidemic in 2009. Each time, they gave the vaccine companies immunity from liability, and they sold, tens of millions of dollars worth of vaccine, unnecessary vaccines. Many of them caused profound impacts. And then the Zika pandemic was a fake pandemic. There was, Tony Fauci, who was claiming that Zika caused microcephaly, which is a smaller head. And he alarmed, caused panic around the country. People were terrified. They were advising women not to get pregnant. Mm-hmm. Zika was coming to America. And then, the Ebola virus, et cetera. So there's actually one of somebody from his agency actually made a March Madness chart of all the phony pandemics that he's been drumming up over the years, and the triumph one is COVID. On that, then I reprint that in my book, and his signature is at the bottom of the page. Oh, it's something that they've done again and again and again over time that it makes that agency relevant.
Okay, so you don't. Well, you tell me. Was the COVID-19 pandemic fake?
What do you mean fake? There were people dying of COVID-19 all over the world. It was a pandemic. It was a genuine pandemic.
Okay, that's what I'm going for, because you say these other ones were made up, and this one, we've got upwards of 5-6 million people dead. So you agree this one was real, and we needed somebody to manage it. But the question is whether he was the man for the job. We'll continue our discussion with Robert next, but first, wanted to let you know that we did reach out to the Bill Gates Foundation regarding the claim that their vaccine efforts led to women being chemically castrated. Their response to us was, quote, "These claims are false," end quote. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Megyn Kelly Show. Next up in the discussion, we talk about how Dr. Fauci and other public health leaders have misled the public about the origins of this pandemic. You will hear Robert reference Dr. Ralph Baric in his lab at UNC Chapel Hill. He says Baric had an issue with creatures escaping from his lab, and people knew it. And according to a 2020 ProPublica article, that's true. Kennedy also claims here that the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, is actually a front for the CIA. According to the New York Times, that's true. The organization was, quote, at times used as a CIA front in the past. And Dr. Fauci once getting a 68% pay raise. You'll hear that too. That's correct as well. But it was for biodefense and not for bioweapons work, as Kennedy is about to claim here. And those two things, according to our experts, are not one and the same. All right, back to the conversation.
And I have another book about to come out called Wuhan Cover-Up, and it shows, it shows that Dr. Fauci, along with other people, with DTRA, with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, with the CIA through USAID, was pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into the enterprise to develop pandemic superbugs that could cause pandemics, and they were keeping them in areas that they all knew they were certain to escape. So, and there's memo after memo after memo that says the Wuhan lab is is a place where, first of all, the bugs were escaping from all their labs at Galveston, at North Carolina. I think his biggest fundee, Ralph Barrick, had 8 or 10 escapes. And Fauci gave him 147 grants, separate grants, tens of millions of hundreds of millions of dollars.
Why? Right? Why is he doing that when this guy can't keep the bugs contained?
I'll tell you why he was doing. I mean, I can explain. Again, I can explain the chronology, and I can explain some of the possible motivations. Nixon had signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972 that made it illegal to handle, store, or develop any kind of biological weapons. But there was a loophole in it. And the loophole said, if it's a dual use research, you can do that, meaning if it's defensive. So a lot of the research that you use to develop bioweapons is identical to the research that you use to develop a vaccine, or it can be. And so the Pentagon wanted to start doing this kind of research, but it was worried that the public would not believe that the Pentagon was doing all of this bioweapons research in order to develop vaccines. It just didn't seem plausible. So they outsourced it to Tony Fauci, and they gave him a 68% raise, which is one of the reasons today he is the highest paid person in the history of the federal government. He makes $434,000 a year, and the president only makes $400,000. So he gets more than the president or the vice president. Wow. And a lot of that is money that's coming from his military bioweapons function.
Yes.
So they began pumping $1.7 billion into, he already has a $6.1 billion budget. On top of that, they gave him $1.7 billion to begin developing bioweapons. That is now at $2.2 billion a year. And he then distributes that to different labs, around the country. And in 2014, 3 of the bugs escaped. 3 bugs from U.S. labs escaped. Dangerous blood bugs were found, in very, very dangerous places, including smallpox. And 300 leading bioweapons experts, including Mark Lipsitch of Harvard and Richard E. Bright from Rutgers, were kind of the leading voices in that space, signed a petition, 300 people, to Obama, asking Obama to shut down Tony Fauci's experiments because they were feared that he would release a pandemic. Mm-hmm. And Tony Fauci and the Obama administration issued a cease and desist order to Tony Fauci. He defied the order, and he continued doing the experiments at Ralph Barrick's labs, which were the worst experiments, because he was engineering these gain-of-function bugs in ways that nobody had ever devised before. But he moved a lot of his operations to Wuhan, where they would be out of sight of the White House. And he laundered the money through this, zoologist called Peter Daszak.
Yeah, our audience knows him.
Health Alliance. But at the same time, he was giving millions of dollars every year, but the big money was coming from USAID, which is, well-known as a CIA front group, and from DTRA, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, as well as millions of dollars from BARDA and DARPA, which are all connected to the U.S. military. And they were
and just to pause and interject, that's backed up by the fact that, thankfully now we've seen, thanks to The Intercept and some other folks who have gotten FOIA requests and information, that this EcoHealth Alliance was trying to hit up Anthony Fauci for money for gain of function. And when they couldn't get it directly, they went to DARPA. They went to the defense agency saying, how about from you? All that's been out now. So there's proof of everything you're saying. Keep going.
Yeah. So then they began, the Chinese were already doing these kind of studies, and Fauci had been doing them since 2002. He had funded a study by a scientist called Kuo, where they had taken a mouse virus and made it so it could not infect mice, but it would infect and kill cats. Oh, it was like it was a gift to the mouse community. but in doing that, he had proven that you could do engineer these cross species transmission, and people were really freaked out about it. And they did a lot of other sketchy experiments. He ended up in China. The Chinese government the U.S. government was saying, we're not really doing weapons development. We're really doing vaccine development. The lead scientist was Xing Li, who was called the Bat Lady.
Yep.
And Ralph Barrick, who is Fauci's favorite funder from the University of North Carolina, started exchanging samples with her of spike proteins and teaching her and working with her about how to take the spike protein from how to remove the spike protein that affected bats and build a spike protein that had this furin cleave site that could attach to human lung cell. And then they tested it they were breeding mice, humanized mice that had human lungs. And they would give it to the mice, not only to see if they could kill the mice and infect them, but also to see if they could get the mice to cough and infect each other. And they succeeded in doing that. And then he did something, but Tony Fauci can still say, what I'm doing is for medical purposes. We're developing these things, and then we're going to develop defenses against them. He funded one study that put the lie to all of that. He funded Ralph Barrick to develop a technique called seamless ligation. And that is a technique for hiding the engineering project. So you could, normally when you do that kind of engineering, you can see it and you can say that bug was created in a lab. He developed a way of hiding all traces that it was developed. And he taught that to the Chinese scientists, to Xing Li. And that, there is no public health. It is the opposite of what you would do if you were interested in public health. It's the opposite. If you're interested in public health, you would make sure that any kind of tampering you did like that had red flags all over it that says, we made this thing. To teach people how to hide that only has a nefarious purpose.
And that's because he was getting so much money from the Defense Department. Like he had to keep that money flowing.
Megyn, I don't look into his head. I just show what the facts are. He was getting the money. He was doing these experiments. And I can show that he knew that something had to escape this lab, because but Ralph Barrick's lab is famous as the most protective, the best protocols, way beyond federal protocols, way beyond any protocols that you use in the world. Ralph Barrick is famous. He brags about it. Other people brag about it. And yet on his lab, he had at least a half a dozen escapes. Mice that were infected bit people and infected them, et cetera. So there was a lot of disasters. So they knew the Chinese labs, the Chinese weren't even using their BSL-4 lab, which is the highest level. They were making these things in BSL-2 labs. The State Department was writing letters. The embassy officials in China inspected the lab and wrote these alarm letters saying there's no protocols here, there's no personnel, there's no safety. Right. We know something's going to escape. And every lab there's escapes from. And this lab, it was clear. And so, if you're a guy with a long history of taking part in fabricating pandemics, I guess it's plausible that one way of creating a real pandemic would be just to do a lot of these experiments in a lot of different places where something is bound to escape. And I'm not saying he did that because I cannot look into his head. And I'm saying it's a consideration that, we know that he knew there were improper safety protocols. And
well, yes, but that's where you lose me on, the suggestion, understanding you're not in his head, that it was intentional. That's suggesting he's a sociopathic lunatic.
I agree with that, and I withdraw that. And I didn't say that. I think if you replay the tape that I said, it's plausible to imagine that this might happen. But again, I withdraw it, and it's something that I don't do in the book. I don't speculate.
Mm-hmm.
I just tell the facts, and
Can I ask you a question? Okay, I got it. So let me ask you this, because we covered this on the show, but there was the moment after we saw the first few cases and the virologists started to look at the virus, they got their first look at it. And there was reporting that Fauci, and Francis Collins, who was then running NIH, they had a conference call with all these maybe 12 top virologists in the world. And they said, let's take a look. What do we think this is? And that virtually all of them came into this call, and the notes reflect that, saying, this is man-made. This looks man-made, looks like it's from a lab. And then miraculously, 4 days later, and after who knows what communications with Fauci and Collins behind the scenes, they all did a 180. And they all stand behind that 180 to this day. It was like, and yet they have failed to share with the rest of us, what was it that changed your very strongly held opinions that it was man-made to this very strongly held opinion, which they were now calling racist, that they were calling the man-made theory racist, to change it 180 to no, definitely came from an animal, zoonotic origin, even though to this day we have yet to find the animal. They've examined it, as I said earlier, 80,000 animals, haven't found it.
Yeah, Megyn, it's also noteworthy that all of those people on that telephone call were doing work at the Wuhan lab, or were receiving money from Tony Fauci, from NIH, that, and not just a little money, tens of millions of dollars and more.
Yeah. Or
from Wellcome Trust, which is the British version of the Gates Foundation, and it's kind of almost like functions as an arm of the pharmaceutical industry. It's essentially the GlaxoSmithKline stock portfolio, and even more interesting, almost all the key players on that phone call who then took part in creating all of this literature out there that characterized suggestions of lab leak as crackpot conspiracy theories. I got thrown off of Instagram, for saying that Congress should investigate this. Virtually all of them, following their publications in The Lancet and Nature Medicine, received huge grants from Tony Fauci. I mean, grants of, 30 million, 40 million, I think up to 60 million. Kristen Anderson, I don't remember exactly what he got, but it could have been as high as $60 million spent after he performed that very, very important task for the medical cartel and the orthodoxy.
We checked that too, that they not only had they received grants beforehand, they received them after their miraculous and as yet unexplained 180. So it goes to a larger point that you make in the book, which is that there's you call it the medical cartel, but there's no daylight between Anthony Fauci and his group and Big Pharma. And there needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, if people ask, how do you fix this? And, that's what you need. You need an independent regulators. We need regulators that are not getting money from pharma, that are not, doing pharma's bidding, but are really working for public health of the American people, that are using real science. Tony Fauci does not study, why are we having an autism epidemic? This would be very easy to find out. We know it has to be an environmental toxin, as you pointed out. And Phil Landrigan has narrowed it down to 11 possibilities that work on the timeline. It's really easy basic science to figure out which of those are contributing. But he will never do those kind of studies. And if anybody tries to do those studies, he will punish them. He will, listen, you can go in the public health records for Kaiser, the HMO records. If, let's say, you're a young associate professor at UCLA Medical School. You want to do a publication, an easy publication would do, get a hold of the Kaiser Permanente medical records, a depersonalized version, so you can't tell who the people are. And then look at the vaccine records and look at associations with subsequent diagnoses for autism or ADD or peanut allergies. If you try to do a study, propose a study, like an NIH is going to find out because they fund everything. And, it's likely that the dean of your medical school will get a call from Hugh Auchincloss or, one of Tony Fauci's other operatives saying, don't let this clown do this study, or is going to put 50 or 60 or $100 million in annual funding from NIH to your medical school in jeopardy. So between him and Gates and Wellcome Trust, Jeremy Farrar, who is up to his neck in Wuhan, they provide 64% of the biomedical research on the planet. If you are a young researcher, a scientist, a professor at a medical school, they have the capacity not only to make your career, but also to ruin it. And that's the way that they control not only the scientific studies that get done, but also the outcome of all those studies across the planet. And, they're what Fauci has done, what he's supposed to do that kind of study. Instead, what he does is he spends the bulk of his budget developing medications, which they then farm out to the university to do phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials. And the university could make $100 million on one of those trials. Plus, it gets royalty rights to the drug they're developing. Then, so NIAID takes royalty rights. The university takes royalty rights. The principal investigator, who is the professor at the university who's running the clinical trial, recruiting the volunteers, he may get $15,000 a volunteer in grant money, and then he gets royalty rights. And then the pharmaceutical industry comes in for the phase 3, and they then own the bulk of the patent, but they're sharing royalty rights with all these other players. So everybody is now corrupted. Everybody is making money on this drug. And the people who are supposed to be telling us, does the drug actually benefit people, or is it just making money for pharma? Those people don't exist.
Up next, RFK on why Dr. Fauci seems obsessed with making sure all of us get the COVID jab again and again and again. His theory next. You make the related point that Fauci has managed to populate the FDA, the CDC, with all of his loyalists now, which would explain so much of what we saw over the past 2 years.
Yeah, because, Megyn, if you look at how these drugs get approved and recommended, they're not actually being approved by people who work at FDA, by FDA employees. There are committees. One of them is called the VRBPAC committee inside of FDA, and then the ACIP committee and CDC advisory committee on immunization practices. And the FDA committee approves the drug, and then the CDC committee recommends it. But they're not made up of employees of those agencies. They're recruited from outside of those agencies, and almost all of them are recruited from the pharmaceutical industry, or they're academic investigators who are funded by Tony Fauci. Tony Fauci gives away, with his military budget, he gives away a total of about $7.7 billion a year or more, maybe $8 billion now. NIH gives away $42 billion. And Tony Fauci has a lot to say about where that money goes. So it's just, it's vast amounts of money, and it buys a lot of omerta. And that's the problem.
Okay, there's another point you make in the book that is fascinating to me. If we know one thing about Fauci, it's that he is obsessed with telling us to get vaccinated. Obsessed. No matter what you ask him, it comes back to get vaccinated, get boosted, boosted, boosted. We need more. And, you know, a lot of us have wondered, why, right? Why? And you make the point in the book about how it's been the vaccine over any therapeutics. You know, this is why you claim he had to shame hydroxychloroquine, had to shame ivermectin. It was like, no, it has to be all about the vaccine. But I had never considered or, you know, read about what you posit in the book, which is, and I'm quoting, by vaccinating the entire population, Dr. Fauci seems to be striving to eliminate the control group to hide vaccine injuries. This is your opinion. I understand that. But that's a very interesting theory because we know from firsthand testimonials we've had on this show and other shows, people have been injured by the vaccine. Not everyone. Obviously, hundreds of millions of doses have been given. But some people have been severely injured. And almost to a person, their story ends with, and I was dumped from the clinical trial and my result was not reported. And the CDC went totally dark on me after acknowledging to me privately that I had a vaccine-related injury, right? So we know injuries have happened. And yet, other than VAERS, which I know is not that reliable because you just self-report and who knows, we don't have something like a completely trusted database that's keeping track of the vaccine injuries that would help us truly understand the level of risk. And I think this is a fascinating theory. And there won't be, is basically what you're saying, because he's trying to get rid of the group that didn't get the vaccine. So we won't have anything to compare it to.
Well, that's, you know, it's again, that's it's hard to explain. It's sort of bewildering to explain why are they, even when they know that the vaccines do not prevent transmission, the vaccines do not prevent people from getting the disease. Mm-hmm. Why is there this single-minded obsession with forcibly vaccinating people with an experimental product?
Well, and let me just jump in. And they know that the large groups that they're demanding get it are at virtually no risk from it. You know, like the young children. So even, yeah, go ahead.
And yeah, I mean, people who get no benefit from the vaccine, it doesn't make any sense. And there's a number of suppositions about why they're doing this, and that's one of them. I mean, it's a product that doesn't work. It's a product that, you know, you get.
Well, you can't say that. I think that's a bridge too far. I mean, you're 65 years old. You get the vaccine. Right. You have a far less chance of getting severe illness or dying. That's
what they say. Oh, and I don't know whether that's true or not. I know that Tony Fauci has admitted the two claims they made for the vaccine at the outset to justify the program was that it prevent you from getting sick and preventing transmission and therefore ending the pandemic, that those are not true. It doesn't work against transmission. It does not reduce it at all as far as the science is concerned.
So I'll say in their defense, and I'm anti-mandate, but I will say in their defense, it worked better at preventing transmission on the original variant, the original form, than it did as Delta came and then Omicron came. I mean, if you look back, like during the first variant, they were saying, we think it's going to prevent transmission. We're not sure it's going to prevent transmission, but it was doing better against that very first variant.
Yeah, I mean, you may be right about that. I'd have to go back and look at the data. But right now, I mean, we're not dealing with the new variant. It doesn't work against Omicron transmission. It doesn't work against Delta. And I know it doesn't work against Delta because the Philippine studies that show that you have an equal viral load. And Tony Fauci has admitted that. Oh, you know, I don't know, and I can't say, and I think we're going to find out over time, hopefully, whether it actually does function in the way, you know, that we hope it does to prevent vaccine injury and death. I'll say, you know, explain to your listeners that that people wonder, why did we need to suppress ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine? These are well-established drugs with well-established safety profiles that have billions of doses have been given. Ivermectin is a human drug. It also works on horses, but it won the Nobel Prize because it works so well on human beings. Mm-hmm. Tony Fauci's problem was this. There's a little-known federal law that says you cannot give an emergency use authorization to a vaccine if there is any medication approved for any purpose that is shown effective against the target disease. So if Tony Fauci or anybody had admitted that hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin are effective against COVID, it would have been illegal for them to give the emergency use authorizations to the vaccines, and they could never have gotten them approved. And it would have been, a 200 billion enterprise that would have collapsed.
That is fascinating. I mean, I have been covering this very closely now for all of the 2 years. That's the first I've heard that. I mean, in your book. So he would not have gotten emergency use authorization for the vaccine if the medical community had been saying ivermectin works. It is an effective treatment for COVID.
Well, the medical community, a lot of it was saying that. I mean, there's 17,000 doctors who've signed a petition, and there are so many peer-reviewed publications now that consistently say that, but he had to aggressively crusade against it to kind of drown out those reports by saying it's a horse medication, it's, people are taking it and it's dangerous and it's overdosing people. And,
well, why did he keep saying it? Why did he keep saying it after he got his authorization?
Well, even if you have the emergency use authorization, the law appears to say you can't have it anymore if there's a functioning medication. So, that may be why. Again, I try not to look in his head, but I do. There's a very, very strong incentive for him to kill ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And, there are many doctors, including Harvey Reich of Yale, is one of the leading biostatisticians, epidemiologists in the world. Peter McCulloch, who is the most published doctor in the history of the world in his specialty. Pierre Corey, these doctors who've treated tens of thousands of COVID patients successfully, they consistently say, and the science supports this, that 500,000 Americans did not need to die.
It should be noted for the record, you're not a medical doctor, don't claim to be. Anthony Fauci is a medical doctor who's, as far as we know, never treated a COVID patient. So just for the record. I want to ask you, though, because you mentioned the fact that you got bounced off of Instagram, where you had a very healthy following, I think 1 million people or so. Correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers, but you got bounced off of there for saying we need to investigate the lab leak theory. You've been, I think you're number 2 on the White House's, quote, disinformation dozen. So we've had a very strange situation where you have government action to try to silence a private citizen from expressing his viewpoints, which is, totally contrary to the First Amendment. And everyone seemed to roll over and say, yep, okay, fine. As long as we're shutting up RFK Jr., that's fine. That's okay with us because he's, anti-COVID vaccine, or he's raising questions about the COVID vaccine. So I wonder how you feel now that some of the claims that, you were making have borne out, right? Like the lab leak theory now is you're allowed to talk about that. And, some of the questions about ivermectin, now people are talking about ivermectin as a serious thing and so on. We could go down the list. What do you think about the censorship you've endured?
Well, to me, Megyn, that's the most disturbing feature of this.
And that is where we will pick it up tomorrow with part 2. The efforts to silence Robert, the personal toll it has taken on his marriage to Cheryl Hines, and why he refuses, despite all of it, to back down. Here's a preview. When your spouse is on the side of the other people, you've done wrong, right? Because your spouse is rooting for you.
Yeah. Well, my spouse is generally rooting for me. But let me tell you, I want to say this. I encourage Cheryl to publish that statement. In fact, I asked her to do a statement that was much tougher than that.
Really?
Which, yes, because, and I'm glad she didn't. I'm very glad she didn't. But I actually gave her language that was much, much tougher than that because she needed to distance herself from me. My job as her husband is to protect her. And the arrows and the bullets that were being slung at me were hitting her. My activities would be jeopardizing this thing that this incredible person put together was just like, I felt like my job is to protect her, and I was doing the opposite of my job. So my heart was breaking, and I was, I would have taken any blow to make sure that she could distance herself.
Plus, he shares the one moment that has always stayed with him after his father's assassination. Before we go, we wanted to let you know that we did reach out to Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Ralph Baric. Neither responded to our request for comment. Remember, you can download The Megyn Kelly Show on Apple, Pandora, Spotify, and Stitcher and help support our reporting and shows and interviews like this by doing so. Also at youtube.com/Megyn Kelly. Again, download and subscribe to the show there. That will help support us, keep us on the air, and make it possible for us to continue bringing you shows like this. Thanks for listening. Part 2 coming up tomorrow.